In the labyrinthine depths of human consciousness, where shadows dance with light and the echoes of childhood reverberate through the corridors of adult existence, lies a profound truth that Carl Gustav Jung spent his lifetime illuminating. The journey towards psychological wholeness is not merely an intellectual exercise but a heroic quest that demands we confront the most vulnerable aspects of ourselves, the wounded child within who holds both our deepest pain and our greatest potential for transformation. The man who sits across from me in therapy sessions, the woman who stares back from the mirror each morning, the executive who commands boardrooms yet trembles at the thought of intimate vulnerability, all carry within them the archetypal wounded child, that primal aspect of psyche that bears the imprints of early experiences, unmet needs, and the innocent trust that was either nurtured or betrayed in those formative years. Jung understood that this inner child is not merely a metaphorical construct but a living, breathing aspect of our psychological reality that continues to influence our thoughts, emotions, relationships, and life choices long after we have grown into adult bodies. The paradox of human development reveals itself in the recognition that our greatest wounds often become the source of our greatest strength, but only when we possess the courage to face them directly. The inner child represents both our primal vulnerability and our authentic power, the part of us that knew joy before it learned fear, that trusted before it learned betrayal, that loved before it learned the protective mechanisms of the ego. When this child remains wounded and unintegrated, we find ourselves perpetually reactive, seeking validation from external sources, repeating patterns that no longer serve us, and living from a place of unconscious programming rather than conscious choice. Jung's analytical psychology offers us a roadmap for this journey of integration, suggesting that the path to psychological maturity requires us to become both the loving parent and the wounded child within our own psyche. This process of individuation, the development of the individual personality, cannot occur without a conscious relationship with our inner child, for it is through this relationship that we heal the split between our conscious ego and our unconscious depths, between who we think we should be and who we authentically are. The wounded child within us carries the imprints of every moment we felt unsafe, unseen, unloved, or misunderstood. These experiences create what Jung called complexes, autonomous clusters of psychic energy that operate below the threshold of consciousness, influencing our behavior in ways we rarely recognize. When a 40-year-old successful businessman finds himself inexplicably anxious before presentations, he may be encountering the activated complex of a child who is shamed for speaking up in class. When a woman finds herself unable to trust in love relationships despite her conscious desire for intimacy, she may be protecting an inner child who learned that love means abandonment or betrayal. The beauty of Jung's approach lies not in pathologizing these responses but in recognizing them as intelligent adaptations that once served to protect us. The child who learned to be hypervigilant in an unpredictable household developed a survival skill that may have been essential then, but becomes limiting in adult relationships. The child who learned to be perfect to earn love developed a strategy that may have prevented rejection but now creates an exhausting burden of never feeling good enough. These protective mechanisms are not character flaws to be eliminated but aspects of our psychological heritage to be honored, understood, and consciously integrated. The process of healing the inner child is not about returning to some idealized state of innocence or eliminating the protective structures we developed. Rather, it involves developing what Jung called a transcendent function, the ability to hold the tension between opposites and find a third way that honors both our need for protection and our desire for authentic expression. This requires us to become conscious parents to our own inner child, providing the safety, validation, and unconditional love that may have been absent in our early environment. When we begin this work, we often encounter what Jung termed the shadow, those aspects of ourselves that we have rejected, denied, or disowned. The wounded inner child is often closely connected to our shadow material, carrying not only our pain but also our disowned power, creativity, spontaneity, and authentic emotional expression. A person who was told as a child that anger was unacceptable may have disowned not only their capacity for healthy anger but also their ability to set boundaries and stand up for themselves. Someone who was shamed for their sensitivity may have rejected not only their vulnerability but also their capacity for empathy and deep emotional connection. The integration of the inner child requires us to reclaim these disowned aspects of ourselves, to recognize that what we perceive as weaknesses may actually be our greatest strengths in disguise. The sensitivity that made us vulnerable to hurt also makes us capable of profound compassion. The intensity that felt overwhelming as children may become the passion that drives our creative expression as adults. The need for connection that made us susceptible to rejection also represents our capacity for authentic intimacy and love. This process unfolds in layers, much like an archaeological dig where each level reveals new artifacts of our psychological history. We may begin by noticing patterns in our adult relationships that seem to echo childhood dynamics. Perhaps we find ourselves repeatedly attracted to partners who are emotionally unavailable, recreating the dynamic of trying to earn love from a distant parent. Or we may discover that our workaholism is driven not by ambition but by an inner child's desperate attempt to prove worthiness to parents who valued achievement over being. As we develop awareness of these patterns, we begin the delicate work of differentiation, learning to distinguish between past and present, between the child's perception and the adult's reality, between automatic reaction and conscious response. This requires developing what might be called dual consciousness, the ability to simultaneously experience our immediate emotional response, which may be coming from the inner child, while also maintaining adult perspective and choice about how to respond. The wounded child within us often operates from a black and white worldview that served as a survival mechanism in childhood but becomes limiting in adult life. Children naturally think in absolutes: people are either good or bad, situations are either safe or dangerous, they are either loved or rejected. This binary thinking helped them navigate a world in which they were genuinely dependent on adult caregivers for survival. However, when this childhood logic continues to operate unconsciously in adult life, it can create significant limitations in our ability to navigate the complexity and ambiguity of mature relationships and life circumstances. The healing process involves gradually introducing what Jung called both/and thinking to replace the child's either/or perspective. We learn that someone can love us and still disappoint us, that we can be successful and still feel insecure, that we can be strong and vulnerable simultaneously. This cognitive flexibility allows us to move beyond the limiting beliefs that the wounded child may have developed about self, others, and the world. One of the most profound aspects of inner child healing involves grieving, mourning what was lost, what never was, and what can never be recovered. This grief is not self-pity but a necessary process of acknowledging reality so that we can stop unconsciously seeking from current relationships what was missing in our original family system. When we fully grieve the fantasy of the perfect childhood or the ideal parents, we become free to appreciate the relationships and opportunities that are actually available to us in the present moment. The wounded child often carries not only personal trauma but also what Jung called the collective unconscious inherited patterns and archetypal energies that span generations. Family systems theory suggests that unhealed trauma and unconscious patterns often get passed down through generations until someone in the lineage develops the consciousness and courage to break the cycle. When we heal our own inner child, we not only transform our personal life but potentially heal wounds that may have been carried by our ancestors and might have been transmitted to our descendants. This transgenerational healing aspect of inner child work reveals why Jung emphasized that individuation is not a selfish pursuit but a service to humanity. When we heal our own unconscious patterns and develop a conscious relationship with our inner child, we become less likely to unconsciously wound others, especially children in our care. We break cycles of projection, blame, and emotional reactivity that may have operated in our family system for generations. The integration of the inner child also involves reclaiming our capacity for what Jung called original thinking, the creativity, imagination, and fresh perspective that children naturally possess before they learn to conform to social expectations. The wounded child may have learned to suppress these qualities in order to fit in or avoid criticism, but healing involves creating safe internal space for this creative energy to emerge once again. This creative reclamation often manifests as a renewed interest in artistic expression, play, spontaneity, and joy. Adults who reconnect with their inner child frequently rediscover talents and interests they abandoned in childhood, finding themselves drawn back to music, art, dance, writing, or other forms of creative expression. This is not regression but progression, the development of what Jung called the divine child archetype, which represents our capacity for renewal, hope, and creative transformation. The process of healing the inner child inevitably brings us face to face with our relationship to authority. The wounded child often carries confusion about power, either giving it away completely in an attempt to remain safe and loved, or wielding it defensively to avoid re-experiencing helplessness. Healing involves developing what might be called authentic authority, the ability to be in our power without dominating others, to lead without controlling, to be strong without being rigid. This authentic authority emerges as we learn to trust our inner guidance rather than constantly seeking validation from external sources. The healed inner child becomes an internal ally rather than a source of self-doubt, offering access to intuition, spontaneity, and authentic emotional expression. We learn to discern between the voice of fear, which often sounds like criticism we internalized as children, and the voice of wisdom, which may come through our body sensations, emotions, or sudden knowing. The wounded child often struggles with boundaries, either having walls that are too high and rigid or boundaries that are too permeable and easily violated. Healing involves learning to create what might be called conscious boundaries, protective structures that allow for intimacy while maintaining individual integrity. This requires developing the capacity to say no without guilt, to ask for what we need without shame, and to honor our own emotional truth while remaining empathically connected to others. As we progress in this healing journey, we begin to recognize that the inner child is not separate from our adult self but is an integral aspect of our whole being that brings vitality, authenticity, and heart to our mature capabilities. The goal is not to fix or eliminate the child but to create an internal family system in which our adult consciousness can provide protection and guidance while our inner child contributes spontaneity, creativity, and emotional aliveness. This integration process often involves what might be called corrective experiences, consciously providing for ourselves what was missing in our childhood environment. This might mean learning to comfort ourselves when distressed, celebrating our achievements even if others don't notice, or creating the safety and predictability that we needed as children. These corrective experiences gradually rewire our nervous system and emotional responses, creating new neural pathways that support healthier patterns of thinking and relating. The wounded child within us often carries not only pain but also profound wisdom. Children are naturally attuned to energy, authenticity, and emotional truth in ways that adults often lose as we learn to navigate social expectations and professional demands. As we heal our inner child, we often rediscover our intuitive abilities, our capacity for deep feeling, and our ability to sense what is real and what is performance in human interactions. This intuitive wisdom becomes particularly valuable in our relationships. The healed inner child can serve as an early warning system, alerting us when something doesn't feel safe or authentic, while our adult consciousness can evaluate these feelings and make conscious choices about how to respond. We learn to honor our emotional truth while also considering practical realities and the perspectives of others. The integration of the inner child also transforms our relationship to authority figures and institutions. Rather than automatically rebelling against or submitting to external authority, we learn to evaluate situations based on our own values and intuitive sense of what serves our highest good and the good of others. This discernment allows us to engage with authority from a place of choice rather than unconscious reactivity. One of the most challenging aspects of inner child healing involves learning to tolerate the discomfort of growth and change. The wounded child often clings to familiar patterns, even when they are painful, because familiarity feels safer than the unknown. Healing requires developing what might be called courage consciousness, the willingness to feel afraid while still taking steps toward what we know serves our growth and well-being. This courage emerges gradually as we build trust with ourselves through small acts of self-care and self-advocacy. Each time we honor our own feelings, set a healthy boundary, or make a choice based on our authentic desires rather than others' expectations, we strengthen our relationship with our inner child and build confidence in our ability to navigate life's challenges from a place of wholeness rather than woundedness. The wounded child often carries shame, the belief that there is something fundamentally wrong or unlovable about our essential nature. Healing involves distinguishing between guilt, feeling bad about something we did, and shame, feeling bad about who we are. While guilt can serve as a moral compass guiding us toward better choices, shame is almost always destructive, creating a sense of unworthiness that undermines our ability to receive love, pursue our dreams, or contribute our unique gifts to the world. Transforming shame requires developing what might be called unconditional self-acceptance, the ability to love ourselves not because we are perfect but because we are inherently valuable as conscious beings. This acceptance doesn't mean approving of all our behaviors or avoiding growth and change, but rather recognizing that our worth is not dependent on our performance, achievements, or the approval of others. As we develop this unconditional self-acceptance, we often discover that our capacity for loving others also expands. When we are no longer seeking validation from external sources to fill the hole of unworthiness within us, we become free to love others for who they are rather than for what they can provide us. Our relationships become less needy and more generous, less desperate and more spacious. The healing journey also involves reclaiming our right to pleasure, joy, and celebration. The wounded child may have learned that happiness is dangerous, that if we allow ourselves to feel too good, something bad will happen to bring us back down. Or we may have learned that we don't deserve good things, that suffering is more noble than joy, or that pleasure is selfish or shameful. Reclaiming our right to joy often requires challenging these inherited beliefs and gradually allowing ourselves to experience and express positive emotions without guilt or fear. This might involve something as simple as allowing ourselves to laugh freely, dance without self-consciousness, or feel excited about our accomplishments. As we practice receiving and expressing positive emotions, we create new neural pathways that support a more balanced emotional life. The integration of the inner child ultimately leads to what Jung called psychological individuation, the development of a unique, authentic personality that is no longer primarily driven by unconscious complexes and projections. This doesn't mean becoming selfish or inconsiderate of others, but rather becoming so securely rooted in our own sense of worth and identity that we can engage with others from a place of choice rather than compulsion. This individuation process often involves periods of what might be called conscious disorientation as we release old identities and patterns without yet having fully formed new ones. These transitional periods can feel uncomfortable but are essential aspects of growth and transformation. Learning to trust the process of becoming, even when we can't see the destination, is a crucial skill in inner child healing. The wounded child within us often carries what might be called inherited loyalties, unconscious commitments to repeat family patterns, even when those patterns are harmful or limiting. Healing involves examining these loyalties and making conscious choices about which family values and patterns we want to carry forward and which we want to transform or release. This process requires what might be called loving differentiation, the ability to honor our family of origin while also honoring our own authentic development. We learn that we can love our parents and still choose different values, that we can appreciate our cultural heritage while also adapting it to our contemporary reality, that we can carry forward the gifts of our lineage while healing the wounds. As we progress in healing our inner child, we often discover that our life purpose becomes clearer and more compelling. The wounded child may have been focused primarily on survival, safety, and gaining approval, but the healed child has access to inspiration, creativity, and a sense of unique contribution to make to the world. Our work becomes less about proving ourselves and more about expressing ourselves, less about earning love and more about sharing love. This shift in motivation often leads to significant changes in career, relationships, and lifestyle as we align our external life with our internal truth. These changes may be gradual or sudden, but they are usually characterized by a sense of coming home to ourselves, of finally living in alignment with our deepest values and authentic desires. The journey of healing the inner child is not a destination but an ongoing process of deepening self-awareness, compassion, and authenticity. As we develop a conscious, loving relationship with this vulnerable aspect of ourselves, we become more resilient, more creative, more emotionally available, and more capable of genuine intimacy with others. The second movement in this symphony of inner transformation reveals itself in the alchemical process of transmuting our deepest wounds into sources of strength and wisdom. Jung understood that the psyche possesses an inherent drive toward wholeness, what he termed the transcendent function, which can transform even the most painful experiences into opportunities for growth and expanded consciousness. The wounded inner child, when met with conscious love and acceptance, becomes not a burden to be healed but a gateway to profound personal power and authentic expression. This transformation is not about denying or minimizing our pain but about changing our relationship to it. The wounded child often experiences hurt as evidence of fundamental unworthiness or cosmic injustice, creating narratives of victimhood that, while understandable, ultimately limit our capacity for agency and growth. Healing involves developing what might be called mature emotional intelligence, the ability to feel our pain fully while simultaneously recognizing our power to choose our response to that pain. The process begins with what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. Rather than trying to eliminate our pain or immediately jump to positive thinking, we learn to create internal space for both our woundedness and our wholeness, our vulnerability and our strength, our past pain and our present possibilities. This capacity to hold paradox without immediately resolving it into a more comfortable either/or position is essential for psychological maturity and authentic transformation. When we can sit with our inner child's pain without immediately trying to fix it, explain it away, or escape from it, something remarkable often occurs. The pain begins to reveal its deeper message, not just what was wrong in our childhood, but what was needed, what was longed for, what essential qualities of being were suppressed or underdeveloped. The child who was criticized for being too sensitive may discover that their sensitivity is actually a form of emotional intelligence and empathic awareness that the world desperately needs. The child who was punished for being too intense may recognize that their intensity is passion waiting to find healthy expression. This reframing process is not about positive thinking or denial but about expanding our perspective to see the wholeness of our experience. Every wound carries within it information about our authentic nature and our deepest values. The child who was hurt by betrayal develops a profound appreciation for loyalty and trustworthiness. The child who experienced neglect often grows into an adult with exceptional capacity for nurturing and attention to others' needs. The child who felt powerless may become an advocate for justice and protection of the vulnerable. The wounded child often develops what might be called survivor strategies, patterns of behavior, thinking, and relating that were adaptive in childhood but become limiting in adult life. Rather than pathologizing these strategies, Jung's approach invites us to honor their original wisdom while consciously evolving them to serve our current life circumstances. The child who learned to be hypervigilant may have developed exceptional awareness and intuition that can be channeled into positive leadership or creative expression rather than chronic anxiety. This evolution of our survival strategies requires what might be called conscious choice-making. Instead of automatically reacting from our childhood programming, we learn to pause, notice what is happening in our internal landscape, and consciously choose our response based on present reality rather than past conditioning. This pause between stimulus and response is where our freedom lives, and it is in this space that we transform from victims of our circumstances into conscious creators of our experience. The wounded child often carries what psychologists call limiting beliefs, unconscious assumptions about self, others, and the world that were formed during childhood and continue to operate below the threshold of awareness. These beliefs might include, I am not worthy of love, the world is dangerous, I must be perfect to be accepted, I cannot trust anyone, or I am responsible for everyone else's feelings. Healing involves bringing these beliefs into conscious awareness and examining their current validity and usefulness. This examination process requires what might be called investigative compassion, the willingness to look honestly at our unconscious patterns without judgment or harsh self-criticism. We become like loving detectives, curious about the origins and functions of our beliefs while remaining kind and patient with ourselves throughout the process. This approach is radically different from the self-criticism that often accompanies our attempts at self-improvement, which usually just reinforces the wounded child's sense of being wrong or bad. As we examine our limiting beliefs, we often discover that they contain partial truths that were overgeneralized or absolutized during childhood. Perhaps it was true that a particular person or environment was unsafe, but the child's mind concluded that all people or all environments are unsafe. Perhaps it was true that love was conditional in our family of origin, but the child's logic concluded that all love is conditional everywhere. Healing involves differentiating between what was true then and there versus what is true here and now. This differentiation process is often supported by what might be called corrective experiences, situations in which we discover through direct experience that our childhood conclusions don't apply to all circumstances. When someone who believes, I always get abandoned, finds themselves in a relationship where they are consistently shown up for, their nervous system gradually learns that abandonment is not inevitable. When someone who believes, I am not capable, successfully completes a challenging project, their self-concept begins to expand beyond childhood limitations. The wounded child often struggles with what might be called emotional regulation, the ability to experience intense feelings without being overwhelmed by them or unconsciously acting them out in ways that damage relationships or sabotage goals. Childhood trauma often disrupts the natural development of emotional regulation skills, leaving us feeling either emotionally numb and disconnected or emotionally flooded and reactive. Healing involves developing what might be called emotional literacy, the ability to recognize, name, understand, and consciously work with our emotional experience. This includes learning to distinguish between current emotions that are appropriate responses to present circumstances and emotions that are being triggered by past experiences. When a current situation activates an emotional response that seems disproportionate to the actual circumstances, we can gently investigate whether our inner child is being activated by similarities to past wounding. This emotional literacy also includes learning what Jung called active imagination, the ability to consciously engage with our internal imagery, emotions, and sensations in ways that promote healing and integration. We might visualize having conversations with our inner child, offering comfort and reassurance, or asking what they need from us. We might use creative expression like drawing, writing, or movement to give voice to aspects of our experience that don't easily translate into words. The wounded child often carries what might be called somatic memories, trauma that is stored in the body as tension, pain, illness, or disrupted nervous system functioning. Jung recognized that the psyche and soma are intimately connected, and that true healing often requires working with both psychological and physical dimensions of our experience. The body holds the score of our early experiences, and healing the inner child often involves learning to listen to and work with our body's wisdom. This somatic dimension of healing might include practices like breathwork, yoga, massage, dance, or other forms of embodied awareness that help us develop a trusting relationship with our physical being. Many people who experience childhood trauma develop a sense of alienation from their bodies, viewing the body as either unreliable, shameful, or dangerous. Healing involves reclaiming the body as an ally and source of wisdom rather than an enemy to be controlled or ignored. The process of integrating our wounded child often brings us face to face with what Jung called our personal mythology, the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, where we come from, and where we're going. These stories often originated in childhood as attempts to make sense of confusing or painful experiences, and they continue to shape our perception of reality and our choices long after their original context has passed. Some common elements of wounded child mythology include: I am the family scapegoat, I am responsible for everyone else's happiness, I must earn love through achievement, I am different and don't belong anywhere, or life is a struggle and joy is temporary. These stories often contain elements of truth but become problematic when they remain unconscious and continue to limit our perception of current possibilities. Healing involves what might be called conscious story editing, examining our personal mythology with curiosity and compassion, honoring the truth it contains while also recognizing where it may no longer serve our growth and well-being. This is not about denying our history but about expanding our identity beyond the roles and limitations that may have been necessary for childhood survival. This story editing process often involves grieving the loss of familiar identities, even when those identities were painful or limiting. There can be a strange comfort in known suffering, and letting go of victim stories, even ones that are accurate, can feel disorienting and frightening. Who are we if we're not the wounded one, the responsible one, the one who sacrifices for others? This identity crisis is often a necessary passage in the journey toward authentic selfhood. The wounded child often develops what might be called attachment strategies, patterns of relating that were designed to maintain connection with early caregivers but may interfere with healthy adult relationships. These might include people-pleasing, emotional caretaking, avoidance of intimacy, or dramatic expressions of distress to get attention. While these strategies may have been adaptive in childhood, they often create the very relationship problems they were designed to prevent. Healing involves developing what attachment theorists call earned secure attachment, the ability to create healthy, balanced relationships characterized by both intimacy and autonomy, both emotional availability and appropriate boundaries. This often requires learning new relationship skills while also addressing the underlying fears and beliefs that drive our attachment strategies. One of the most profound aspects of this healing journey is the recognition that our wounds often point us toward our gifts and life purpose. The qualities that made us vulnerable as children, sensitivity, intensity, creativity, empathy, nonconformity, are often the very qualities that make us uniquely valuable as adults. The person who is criticized for being too much may discover that their muchness is exactly what the world needs from them. This recognition can lead to what might be called wound-based wisdom, insights and capabilities that emerge directly from our healing journey. The person who healed from childhood abandonment may become exceptionally skilled at creating safety and belonging for others. The person who transformed their perfectionism may become a powerful teacher about self-acceptance and authentic expression. Our wounds become our credentials for helping others navigate similar challenges. The integration process often involves what Jung called the return, bringing the gifts of our inner healing journey back into our external life and relationships. This might manifest as career changes that better align with our authentic values, relationship patterns that reflect our increased self-worth, or creative expressions that emerge from our healed inner child's spontaneity and joy. This return phase can be challenging because it often requires us to disappoint people who have become invested in our remaining in familiar roles. Family members, friends, or colleagues may resist our changes, preferring us to remain the person they have known rather than supporting our growth into who we are becoming. Learning to maintain our integrity while navigating others' reactions to our transformation is an essential skill in this phase of the journey. The wounded child often carries what might be called spiritual wounds, damage to our natural sense of connection to something larger than ourselves, whether we call that God, universe, life force, or simply the mystery and beauty of existence. Childhood trauma can create a sense of cosmic abandonment or punishment, leaving us feeling fundamentally alone and unsupported by life itself. Healing the spiritual dimension of our inner child wounds often involves what might be called re-enchantment, rediscovering our sense of wonder, meaning, and connection to the sacred dimensions of existence. This doesn't necessarily require adopting particular religious beliefs but rather reconnecting with our innate capacity for awe, gratitude, and trust in the larger intelligence that governs life. This spiritual healing often emerges naturally as we develop a more loving relationship with ourselves. As we learn to see ourselves with compassion and acceptance, we often begin to perceive the same divine spark in others and in nature. Our capacity for love expands beyond our personal circle to include what Jung called the collective unconscious, our connection to all of humanity and to life itself. The wounded child often struggles with what might be called existential questions, concerns about meaning, purpose, mortality, and our place in the larger scheme of existence. Childhood trauma can intensify these concerns, creating anxiety about death, meaninglessness, or cosmic insignificance. Healing involves developing what might be called existential courage, the ability to live fully and love deeply despite uncertainty about ultimate questions. This existential dimension of healing often involves accepting what cannot be known while committing to what can be lived and loved in this moment. We learn to find meaning not in having all the answers but in living our questions with integrity and heart. This acceptance paradoxically often leads to profound experiences of meaning and connection that transcend intellectual understanding. The integration of our wounded child ultimately leads to what might be called authentic adulthood, the capacity to be simultaneously strong and tender, wise and wondering, grounded and growing. This is not the pseudo-maturity that comes from suppressing our emotional and creative nature but rather the genuine maturity that emerges from embracing all aspects of our humanity with consciousness and choice. This authentic adulthood is characterized by what Jung called individuation, the development of a unique, integrated personality that is no longer primarily driven by unconscious complexes or external expectations. We become who we truly are rather than who we think we should be or who others need us to be. This individuation serves not only our personal fulfillment but also our capacity to contribute something genuinely valuable to the world. The third and final movement of this transformative journey unveils the ultimate paradox that Jung recognized as central to human development. The very act of facing and integrating our deepest vulnerabilities becomes the source of our greatest invulnerability to external destruction. When we heal our inner child and embrace our authentic wholeness, we develop what might be called essential invincibility, not the brittle armor of defensive strategies but the flexible strength of integrated consciousness. This invincibility emerges from the recognition that our true security lies not in controlling external circumstances or maintaining perfect facades but in developing an unshakable relationship with our own essential nature. The person who has faced their deepest fears, felt their most painful emotions, and integrated their most rejected aspects can no longer be controlled through threats to expose or activate these very things. They have already exposed themselves to themselves with complete honesty and have chosen love and acceptance over judgment and rejection. The wounded child often lives in constant fear of being found out, of having their flaws, mistakes, or inadequacies discovered by others. This fear drives enormous amounts of energy into maintaining acceptable images, controlling others' perceptions, and avoiding situations that might reveal vulnerability. The person who has done the inner work of honest self-examination and self-acceptance has already found themselves out and has chosen to love what they discovered rather than hide from it. This self-acceptance creates what might be called psychological sovereignty, the ability to remain internally stable regardless of external approval or disapproval, success or failure, acceptance or rejection from others. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent to others' feelings or feedback, but rather developing the capacity to receive input from others without having our fundamental sense of worth destabilized by it. The integrated person develops what Jung called conscious relationship to the archetypes, awareness of the universal patterns and energies that operate within human consciousness. Rather than being unconsciously possessed by archetypal energies like the victim, the hero, the rebel, or the pleaser, they can consciously work with these energies as needed while maintaining their individual identity and choice. This conscious relationship prevents them from being manipulated through appeals to these archetypal patterns. The wounded child often operates from what might be called external locus of control, the belief that their happiness, security, and sense of worth depend primarily on external circumstances and other people's behavior. Healing involves developing an internal locus of control, the recognition that while we cannot control external events, we always maintain the power to choose our response to those events, and that this response ultimately determines our experience of life. This shift in locus of control is perhaps the most significant factor in becoming undestroyable by others. When our sense of worth, peace, and joy no longer depends on external validation or perfect circumstances, others lose the ability to destroy our equanimity through criticism, rejection, betrayal, or abandonment. These experiences may still cause pain, but they no longer threaten our fundamental stability or sense of self. The person who has integrated their shadow, those aspects of personality that were rejected or denied, can no longer be controlled through shame about these aspects. They have already acknowledged their capacity for anger, selfishness, fear, sexuality, aggression, or whatever qualities they were taught were unacceptable. This acknowledgement paradoxically gives them choice about when and how to express these energies rather than having them leak out unconsciously or be suppressed at great psychological cost. This integration creates what might be called emotional honesty, the ability to acknowledge the full spectrum of human emotions and responses without judgment while choosing conscious expression rather than unconscious reaction. The person who can admit to feeling jealous, angry, hurt, or afraid cannot be manipulated through attempts to trigger shame about these feelings. They can feel their emotions fully while choosing their actions consciously. The wounded child often suffers from what might be called approval addiction, the compulsive need for external validation that drives people-pleasing, perfectionism, and self-abandonment. Healing involves developing what might be called internal validation, the ability to recognize and appreciate our own worth, progress, and authentic expression independent of others' recognition or approval. This internal validation doesn't mean becoming narcissistic or dismissive of feedback from others, but rather developing enough self-awareness and self-appreciation that external feedback becomes information rather than the determinant of our worth. We can appreciate compliments without becoming addicted to them and receive criticism without being devastated by it. The integrated person often develops what might be called strategic vulnerability, the conscious choice of when, where, and with whom to share intimate aspects of themselves rather than either hiding behind walls of protection or unconsciously oversharing with anyone who will listen. This conscious vulnerability creates genuine intimacy while maintaining appropriate boundaries, and it cannot be weaponized by others because it is offered as a gift rather than compulsively revealed as a wound. The process of integration often involves what might be called reclaiming projections, recognizing how we have unconsciously placed our disowned qualities, both positive and negative, onto others. The wounded child often engages in extensive projection as a way of managing overwhelming internal experiences. Healing involves taking back these projections and recognizing both our capacity for the negative qualities we see in others and our possession of the positive qualities we admire in others. This reclamation of projections creates psychological wholeness and makes us much more difficult to manipulate. When we recognize our own capacity for both good and evil, both wisdom and foolishness, both strength and weakness, others cannot control us by positioning themselves as all good or all bad or by positioning us in these extreme roles. We see the humanity in both ourselves and others, which creates the possibility for authentic relationship while preventing idealization or demonization. The wounded child often operates from what might be called scarcity consciousness, the belief that there is not enough love, approval, success, or security to go around, creating competition and anxiety about having needs met. Healing involves developing abundance consciousness, the recognition that our essential needs for love, meaning, and creative expression can be met through our own development and conscious choices rather than depending entirely on external supply. This abundance consciousness emerges from the recognition that many of our deepest needs can actually be met internally through conscious self-relationship. We can provide ourselves with the encouragement, comfort, celebration, and companionship that we may have sought exclusively from others. This doesn't mean becoming isolated or independent to an unhealthy degree, but rather approaching relationships from a place of choice and generosity rather than desperate neediness. The person who has learned to meet their own emotional needs becomes much more attractive to others because they are no longer energetically demanding or draining. They can offer genuine love and support to others because they are not primarily focused on getting their own needs met through the relationship. This creates what might be called magnetic authenticity, the natural attractiveness of someone who is complete within themselves while remaining open to connection with others. The integrated person often develops what might be called meta-emotional awareness, the ability to observe their own emotional processes with curiosity and compassion rather than being completely identified with every emotional state. This creates space between themselves and their emotions, allowing them to experience feelings fully while maintaining choice about how to express and act on those emotions. This meta-emotional awareness prevents others from controlling them through emotional manipulation because they can recognize when someone is attempting to trigger specific emotional responses and can choose whether or not to engage with these attempts. They might still feel anger when someone attacks them, but they won't necessarily react from that anger in ways that serve the attacker's agenda. The wounded child often struggles with what might be called identity confusion, uncertainty about who they really are beneath the roles, masks, and adaptations they develop to survive and succeed in their environment. Healing involves developing what might be called essential identity, a clear sense of core values, authentic preferences, natural talents, and life purpose that remains stable regardless of external circumstances or social roles. This essential identity creates what might be called inner compass, an internal guidance system that helps navigate life decisions based on authentic values rather than external expectations or immediate comfort. The person with a clear inner compass cannot be manipulated into betraying their values through promises of reward or threats of punishment because they have a deeper commitment to their own integrity than to external approval or security. The integration process often reveals what might be called unique genius, the particular combination of gifts, perspectives, and capacities that each person possesses and that represents their potential contribution to the world. The wounded child's unique genius is often buried beneath adaptations and defenses, but healing allows these authentic gifts to emerge and find expression. This recognition of unique genius creates what might be called purpose-driven confidence, assurance that comes not from comparing oneself favorably to others but from knowing that one has something valuable and irreplaceable to offer. This confidence cannot be shaken by others' attempts at diminishment because it is based on truth rather than ego inflation. The person who has integrated their inner child often develops what might be called comfort with imperfection, the ability to make mistakes, fail, and be flawed without having their sense of worth threatened. This comfort paradoxically often leads to greater success and effectiveness because energy is no longer wasted on perfectionism and self-protection but can be directed toward learning, growth, and creative expression. This comfort with imperfection makes others' criticism far less threatening because mistakes and flaws are no longer seen as evidence of fundamental inadequacy but simply as information about areas for potential growth or aspects of human limitation to be accepted with humor and grace. The person who can laugh at their own mistakes and learn from their failures cannot be crushed by others' attempts to shame or diminish them. The integrated person often develops what might be called existential acceptance, peace with the fundamental uncertainties and limitations of human existence. This includes acceptance of mortality, the inability to control others or guarantee specific outcomes, and the mystery of existence itself. This acceptance creates profound freedom from the anxiety and desperate controlling behaviors that characterize much human suffering. This existential acceptance paradoxically often leads to greater effectiveness and joy in living because energy is no longer wasted fighting against unchangeable realities. The person who accepts that they cannot control others' behavior becomes free to focus on their own choices and responses. The person who accepts that life includes both joy and suffering can fully embrace the joy when it comes while meeting the suffering with grace when it arises. The wounded child often operates from what might be called conditional love, the belief that love must be earned through good behavior, achievement, or meeting others' expectations. Healing involves discovering unconditional self-love, acceptance, and care for oneself that is not dependent on performance or external validation. This unconditional self-love becomes the foundation for both giving and receiving genuine love in relationships. This unconditional self-love creates what might be called relationship freedom, the ability to enter and maintain relationships from choice rather than compulsion. The person who genuinely loves themselves is not willing to accept treatment that violates their dignity or compromises their well-being, and they are also not compulsively driven to prove their worth through self-sacrifice or people-pleasing. The integration journey often culminates in what might be called service-oriented living, a natural desire to contribute to the well-being of others and the world that emerges from personal fullness rather than personal emptiness. The person who has healed their own wounds often feels called to help others heal similar wounds, but this service comes from overflow rather than deficit, from strength rather than need for validation. This service orientation creates what might be called mission-based invincibility, the strength that comes from being connected to something larger than personal comfort or success. The person who is serving a mission they believe in becomes very difficult to deter or discourage because they are motivated by values and vision rather than just personal gain or approval. The fully integrated person embodies what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold paradox and complexity without immediately resolving them into more comfortable simplicities. They can be strong and gentle, confident and humble, independent and connected, serious and playful. This complexity makes them unpredictable to those who would try to manipulate them through simple formulas or stereotypes. This transcendent function also allows them to find creative solutions to seemingly impossible situations because they are not limited by either or thinking but can discover third alternatives that honor multiple needs and perspectives simultaneously. This creativity and flexibility in problem solving makes them valuable allies and formidable opponents to those who would seek to control or harm them. The ultimate invincibility that emerges from inner child healing is not the absence of vulnerability but the integration of vulnerability with strength, sensitivity with resilience, openness with discernment. This integration creates what might be called authentic power influence that comes from being genuinely helpful and inspiring rather than from domination or manipulation. This authentic power naturally attracts others who are also committed to growth and authenticity while naturally repelling those who operate primarily from manipulation and control. The integrated person creates around themselves what might be called a field of consciousness that supports healing and growth in others while making destructive behaviors feel uncomfortable and obvious. The journey of healing the inner child and becoming undestroyable by others is ultimately a journey toward what Jung called individuation, becoming who one truly is rather than who one thinks one should be. This individuation serves not only personal fulfillment but also the evolution of consciousness itself, as each person who completes this journey adds their unique piece to the puzzle of human potential and contributes to the healing of the collective wounds that span generations. The man or woman who has truly destroyed their weak self, not through harsh rejection but through loving integration, has discovered that what they thought was weakness was often simply unintegrated strength. Their sensitivity becomes wisdom, their intensity becomes passion, their wounds become sources of compassion, and their authenticity becomes a gift to a world hungry for genuine human connection and expression. In this completion, they embody the fundamental truth that Jung spent his life exploring, that wholeness is not the absence of brokenness but the conscious integration of all aspects of human experience into a coherent, authentic, and purposeful life. They have become undestroyable not because they have eliminated vulnerability but because they have made vulnerability and strength, woundedness and wholeness, into allies in service of their essential nature and highest expression. The inner child, once wounded and hidden, becomes the source of creativity, joy, and authentic connection that makes life worth living. The adult consciousness, once rigid and defensive, becomes spacious enough to hold both pain and pleasure, both certainty and mystery, both individual identity and universal connection. Together, they create a human being who is simultaneously deeply rooted in personal truth and flexibly responsive to life's constant invitations for growth and service. This is the ultimate gift of the Jungian approach to healing, not the promise that life will become easy or pain-free, but the recognition that we possess within ourselves everything necessary to meet life's challenges with consciousness, courage, and creativity. We discover that we are not victims of our past but artists of our future, not prisoners of our conditioning but conscious participants in our own becoming. The weak self that must be destroyed is not our vulnerability or our humanity but our unconsciousness, our automatic reactions, our compulsive patterns that no longer serve our growth and expression. What emerges from this conscious destruction is not invulnerability but what might be called conscious vulnerability, the courage to remain open and authentic while developing the wisdom to protect and preserve what is sacred within us. This conscious vulnerability becomes the foundation for genuine strength, authentic relationships, creative expression, and meaningful contribution to the world. It represents the completion of the hero's journey that Jung mapped so carefully, the journey from unconscious suffering through conscious struggle to integrated wisdom and service. In this completion, we discover that healing our inner child is not just personal therapy but a contribution to the healing of the world itself, as each person who completes this journey becomes a source of consciousness, compassion, and authentic power that serves the evolution of human potential itself.